Welcome to this talk on organizing a Confluence hoard. Does this page spark joy? Let me start by introducing myself. My name's Abi Sutherland, and I'm the Nav Information Architect at TomTom. Now, Nav Information Architect means that for my area of TomTom, which is called Nav, my job is to figure out ways that our human readable content can be better, and where possible, actually do the work for that as well. I've been doing this role for about 4 years, and I spent the first 3 years of that job studiously avoiding one problem that I knew I was going to need to solve one day, but I didn't want to think about. And then last year, I dove in. The problem in question is our Confluence estate. So Confluence is TomTom's internal wiki tool, and Nav has been using Confluence for a very long time. As an organizational unit, we had 33 Confluence spaces going. Some of them were dead, most of them were live. Over 20,000 pages there, but a lot of them were old. Nobody was looking at them. They weren't actually very useful ones. So it became obvious that this was something that really needed to get sorted out. It's been a constant source of irritation for everybody. So I've spent a good portion of the last year working here and there, kind of piecemeal because of the way that the teams work, on improving our Nav estate, our Confluence estate, and now I'd like to show you what I did. I'm going to use the structure of one of the foremost organizational experts of these days to explain what I did. And this is Marie Kondo. Marie Kondo is an organizing consultant and author. She's famous for the KonMari method, which is a way of basically information architecting your stuff. It's a way of organizing things that's very user-centric. It's very much focused on what is your experience of your stuff, what are your feelings for your stuff. So she's actually fairly close into some of the things that I've been doing. And she's got this 6 rules of tidying that I thought would be an interesting way to discuss what I've been doing with our Confluence estate. So Marie, take it away. What's the first one? Right, so the first one is commit yourself to tidying up. And that's absolutely right. That's what you need to do. In terms of organizational stuff, what that means is get buy-in. And depending on the work you're doing, you may need to get a business case, you may need to find sponsors, you're going to need to work with your stakeholders, all of those things. In my case, because of the history of things, all I needed to do was say yes the next time somebody said, Abby, could you please do something about Confluence because it's a nightmare? And an added advantage to doing this was as soon as I said, you know what, I'm going to sort out Confluence, all of a sudden I got an enormous amount of user feedback and information. Everybody was like, oh, you're going to sort out Confluence. Well, I just wanted you to know there's this and this and this and this, and I have this experience and there was this thing, and I think the fact that this is wrong is a big priority. And I basically got a flood of user input to use in the next step, which is great. So Maria, what is the next step? That's right. Imagine your ideal lifestyle. Now, when you're talking in terms of this project, what you're talking about is design your future site. And this can be a new site like I did with my greenfield space, or it can be the new site, the redesigned site that you're going to make from your previous mess. Because not everybody can say, you know what? I have 33 houses and they're all a mess, so I'm going to move to another house. I was very fortunate to be able to do this. Think about the designs you do now because you're going to be living with the consequences for a while. Of course, you can redesign your space, but if you do that, then you're going to trip everybody up and it's an enormous amount of work. So if you get it right now, you'll be happy for a long time because of that. One of the first things you want to do really is you want to look at what's wrong with your current site. And I don't just mean that you've got a quadrillion pages and nobody ever looks at them, but why? Why do people do the things they do in your space? Because people don't do things just because. People have reasons for what they do. So these people have chosen to do something for what seems to them good reasons. What's going on here? And I would encourage you to think about problems that you have with how people behave as being like desire paths. And desire paths are something from urban architecture. Basically, they're when people see that there's not a way to go someplace they want to go, and so they make one. So here in my village, there's this lovely piece of sidewalk, and it continues on. And then off of that sidewalk into a park, there is a footpath. It is not an official footpath, but it exists. People have been walking there. They have created a path. Why have they created the path? I don't actually know. Somewhere in there is something they want. There is an unmet need, the need to get to that spot. The city or the village has not provided that. so therefore they have created their own path. That's a marker that you need to look at the need, because that's what's creating the path. So if you find this sort of desire path type problem in your space, you should start thinking about how to solve it. And there are two good ways to solve it and one bad way to solve it. One good way to solve it is to pave the path. Is it possible to just give people the process they need to do the thing? Can you make their way of doing the thing safer, but they've already figured out how they want to do it that fits with their mental models, but can you then pave that? Alternatively, can you meet that need on existing paths? Can you add an option to an existing process that allows them to do this thing that the process didn't let them do, whatever it is? Both of those are really great ways to deal with unmet needs and to reduce the amount of desire paths that start trailing all over your space. The one thing you shouldn't do, because it really doesn't work, is to just fence the path and figure you're done. Because they already made one path. They're just going to walk around your fence and make another because you haven't met that need. So this ties into, or this strikes to the heart of what we're trying to do with this. What we try to do with information architecture and with site design and all of these things. Anyway, what are we trying to do? We're trying to help our users get to the content of their dreams. We're trying to give them that meet cute moment when they find exactly the right thing. And obviously, every tool has its own modalities, its own ways of helping users do that. In Confluence, it's the search box, it's the browse that allows you to look through page trees, it's links. And you need to build it so that those are the tools that your users will find easy to use. So you need to facilitate search, you need to simplify browse. There is, however, something else that you can do. In addition to bringing your user to the content, you can bring the content to the user. Because you're going to have a certain proportion of users who are not going to go all the way down into your site to where the really good stuff is. They're going to sort of lurk at the top. But can you bring that good stuff up to them? So can you extract content from deep pages and bring them to surface pages as summaries, as reports, whatever it is, bringing that content to the users right where they are? And for us, because we do docs as code, which means we've got a bunch of our stuff in ASCII Doctor in Bitbucket instead of in Confluence, can you bring in content from other places as well? And Confluence doesn't play well with, for instance, Microsoft Office documents, but it does play fairly well with things in repositories. There are plugins that you can do, which means that you can, like we do, have your product description, which lives in the repository, sit right next to a bunch of other product information that's native to Confluence. And then your user, you've basically brought your user everything they need. Because of course your users are at the heart of this whole thing, and you need to be thinking about how you design your site in the light of them. And one thing you need to do is figure out what categories of users do you have so that you can understand and meet their needs. And when I did this, I realized that the categories that we had were best defined by their relationship to the actual information they were searching for. And so that information is the yellow bit on that bullseye there. So there are people who are external to our organizational unit. They're still in nav because this is an internal facility. They know the topic, but they don't necessarily know where that information is going to sit. They also don't know the department very well or the site structure very well, because we did a reorg for the department and hey, now we're doing a reorg for the site. Then you've got people who are in the department, but not in the team that owns the information. So they're going to have a better mental model for the department and the products and how those things all go together than people who aren't inside our organizational unit. But they're not necessarily going to know where that particular team keeps all the good stuff. And then there's the team itself, and they should know precisely what they're looking for. They should know roughly where it is, but they're probably going to need some help finding it. So these are your three populations, and you need to look at the combinations of search and browse that they're likely to use, and the level of information they already have versus the level of information you're going to try to teach them as they go so that they can find what they need. And actually, another way to look at your users is that they're your biggest constraint. I suppose is another form of user-first thinking. Your users are a constraint as readers because they have particular ways they behave. There are things they do and things they don't do. There's something called Meno's paradox, which is that if you don't know that a body of knowledge exists, then you can't know that you need to go look for it and learn about it. So at a certain point, you've got a bunch of users who are going to be there, who are not going to know that what they're looking for exists, in what form it exists, or where to find it. You're going to have to teach them that. Another constraint is that your users are also your contributors, and they don't always do that very well. They weren't born to be archivists. It's not their life stream to be archivists. And so they will sometimes do things in archivally unsound ways. For instance, the classic example being, there's an old page which contains a bunch of reference information. They have a bunch of new reference information. But rather than go and try and find the old page, they create a new page with the new stuff, and then they finish the user story that they were trying to do, which included document the new information. And what you're left with is multiple pages of multiple ages. And then you'll have somebody who will come back and update the old page, and it becomes very complicated. Another constraint, another obvious constraint, is the tool itself. Obviously, Confluence has there are things it makes easy and things it makes difficult, and that forms user behavior. Users often have their behavior formed by their experiences of the tool. I talked a little bit just now about how it's difficult to search for old stuff, and so rather than looking for it and finding it to update, people are much more likely to just start a new page with new information. Another thing is that the tool does not make it very easy for people to tag pages, to add labels to pages, which would boost the page's search results. So because it's difficult to do it, they don't do it, and therefore you can't improve the search results. Indeed, there's no way to create a workflow with reviewing pages and like that, even if the users would stand for it. Users also have expectations, and the way those expectations are met or not met by the tool leads to a whole different set of frictions. One of the reasons that search comes across so badly for Confluence is people are used to Google, and Confluence really is not Google. It really does not have that level of quality. So not only do they come at it and say, why can't I find anything? Then the next time they come to the search box, they've already got a level of learned helplessness, and they're already tired before they even start. They're already frustrated. And then there are things that are actual technical limitations to the tool. For instance, the one that I hit really, really hard is that within a given space, every page has to have a unique name. And this hit against some of the other things that I was trying to do around standardization, which I'll get to in a little bit. But that was a hard constraint of the tool. And I know why it exists and all that, but that doesn't change the fact that the tool had a constraint which added friction to what I did. So within that context, in all of these things, your goals and what your users are already doing that they could do better, and these constraints, how can you then create a site that works? And the first thing to think about is how you structure your hierarchies and the results that has, the effects that has on the menus that you use to browse through those hierarchies. So many people say, well, but you really want to you want to reduce the number of clicks that people use in order to reach the content they're looking for. And so therefore you should have a relatively shallow hierarchy, and it should have lots and lots and lots of menu options at each level. So there's always the impulse to, we need this information, let's just create another top level section for it, and another and another and another. But the problem with that is that there's something called the paradox of choice. And the paradox of choice says that it is harder to make a choice when there are too many options. And so a short and wide organizational structure has that problem. And I tend to think of a short and wide organizational structure as being a lot like Gimli the dwarf from The Lord of the Rings. Not just that he's short and wide, but also that he's a very blunt tool sometimes. He has his axe, he does his axe thing. He's not a seasoned diplomat. He doesn't have a lot of depth. The other way to approach a menu or in a hierarchy is to have a very tall, a very deep hierarchy, and then each of the menu options is narrowed down to a relatively low number of choices. So like I said, you would think this is harder to use because of the number of clicks, but the paradox of choice means that each of the clicks is easier, and so the total effort to find your thing may actually be easier with a tall and narrow hierarchy than it was with a short and wide one. It also has a few other advantages. It creates and then reinforces a mental model because you have to make each of these layers make sense. Since you're not just willy-nilly adding more things to it, there's got to be a logical structure to it. And there's also the advantage that you can set aside certain areas and say, you know what? I'm not in control of the structure of these. I'll control stuff higher up, and then I will hand ownership over to people lower down so that they can own their spaces. But you can only do that with a tall and narrow hierarchy because you need to create the structure into which their stuff fits, or you've got chaos. And just for symmetry, if the short and wide hierarchy is then of course the tall and narrow is Legolas, who has relatively few interaction modes when you talk to him, but he actually has lived a very long time and knows a bunch of stuff. So another trade-off to think about is where is the control between the masses and the elite, if you will, the large body of people and the small body of people like the information architect. But you know what? I think it's too soon for this slide. Let's actually change the model here. This particular trade-off goes by a lot of names. There's standardization versus innovation. There's central control versus individual responsibility, top-down, bottom-up. All of them is saying somewhere there is a line where control changes. There's this golden line where the structure changes. So if you are a megalomaniac like me, and you want to control a lot of stuff, there's a bunch of good stuff you can do. You can create and fulfill user expectations. You can add automation, which is also very, very useful. But you can only do that because the pages are standard. So the user sees one page and they recognize it for the next and the next and the next, and so does your automation tool. But it's not a good idea because not every team is similar enough that you can create a standard team by team by team template. Also, a lot of the really good innovation happens in this area where the teams try things out and come up with new ideas. And sometimes the ideas aren't super and you need to talk to them, but they do come up with a lot of very good ideas. And third of all, very, very important, we maintain what we feel like we own. Nobody cleans a hotel room. People clean their own spaces. We need to make sure that people own this. I may be creating a structure. I may be helping the structure to grow and to grow well, but the structure and the pages have to be owned by the team. So however much it's tempting to say, I'm going to control all of this all the way down, I can't do that. I have to let people control it from the bottom. Looking at all of those things, I designed a space. And it doesn't look quite like this, of course. It's more complicated than this, but this gives you the key bits. The first thing is I went all Legolas on the thing. So it's got a tall and narrow hierarchy, and I've controlled the way the categories work at the top. So basically, it isn't quite 3 categories, but things fit into basically there are things that are about people, like organization and sites and stuff like that. There are things about our products. There are things about our process. It's a fairly logical set of things. And then there's that golden line of control. And then below that is the stuff that the teams own and create and design. But the golden line is actually a little more complicated than I made it sound. It's not actually a single line. It's actually a layer of hierarchy in its own right, at least for things like team pages. So I have this standard page that's a landing page for every team. So every team has a bunch of specific information. There's stuff about the outcomes that they're trying to achieve. There's information about the people in the team, particularly the key contacts, the team leaders, the scrum masters, the tech leads, all of that stuff. There's also a little bit of navigation space. So there's a search bar that searches only the team's space because it searches those pages and the child pages below that. There's also a page tree browse, which does the same thing. It only looks at that page and its child pages. Below these team landing pages, which are fairly tightly controlled, is a kind of a semi-controlled section where each team has to have specific pages like organization and outcomes where they put specific information. But they don't necessarily have to put it in the same way. There's got to be some way that I see all of the members of all of your Scrum teams, but how you do that, in what form, whether they're brought up from child pages yet, not bothered. Below these specific pages, teams can make whatever structures, whatever pages, whatever complexity they want. That's down to them. That's their control. They own that. And this allows me to have this sort of overlap between my top down and their bottom up. I talked a little bit about one of the things being in the team landing pages is that there's a search box, and that search box only searches the team's pages. And the reason for that is that, as I may have mentioned once or twice, Confluence's search is a little bit on the disappointing side. And the way to improve Confluence's search that I can do is to limit the search scope, or help people limit their search scope. Because if you look at the search box at the very top of the site and you try and search everything there, that's a lot of pages, which is to say, that's a lot of noise in your signal. But if you can search lower down, so you're searching a smaller scope, then you're searching fewer pages and you're just going to have a better signal to noise ratio. So part of my strategy is helping people to find ways to browse down, navigate down to a place where they can do a constraint search where they'll get better results. Another thing about having this place where the teams own their own content is that I can do that thing I was talking about earlier, where you surface content to people who want it but don't necessarily want to dig for it. A classic example for that is who's in our department. We used to, in the old world, have a page where Scrum Masters were supposed to update their team listing on this page, which was not in their spaces, but was pretty high up, whenever team members changed. And I think at one point, 10% of the names on that page were unknown user, which means that the individual had not just left the department, they'd left TomTom, because it was completely stale content, because it was out of people's field of view. They weren't thinking about it. It wasn't their space. So what I'm doing now is I'm using Confluence's excerpt tool, which means that they can update the information in their own spaces. And then because I've got enough standardization, automatically that information is propagated higher up to where users who aren't going to delve down into the team by team stuff want to see it. This means that I've got all the strength of the low down control, but also all of the power of the top level organization in one. Another thing that I've had to do because of Confluence, and this is, remember I talked about how the Confluence enforces page name uniqueness in the site. This is where the rubber meets the road. I have said that teams are supposed to have specific pages like organization and metrics and all of these things. But obviously, in order to prevent duplication, they're going to have to namespace these pages with their team name. And that's super right up until the point when you realize that everybody's going to name them naturally, which means that it's going to be Gold Team Organization, Gold Team Design, Gold Team whatever else. And that's fine when you look at the page, but when you look at the menu, and particularly when you're browsing and you're way down in the hierarchy and you've got constraint space, suddenly what you see is gold, 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 and that's not helpful. You can't tell what you're looking for. So I've been telling the teams what they need to do is put the new information, the different information early in the name and the name spacing later in the name. Because then when things narrow down, what you get is you get all the relevant information right there. And then the gold stuff can go away and nobody will notice. And that is much better. Okay, Marie, what's next? Finish discarding first. Realistically, that's not going to happen. That's just not the way it works. There's always going to be a trade-off between pragmatism and perfectionism here. The ideal of cleaning up before you move is lovely, because then you don't bring all your junk into the new space and clog up the search with it. But realistically, teams know that that can take a very long time to do, and they're unlikely to schedule it. So basically the whole thing will die on the backlog if you try to be too perfect about it. So you have to accept that a certain amount of cruft is going to follow your team to the new space, unfortunately. Next, tidy by category, not by location, follow the right order. These are basically saying there is a logic way to tidy up your physical stuff, and I will tell it to you. I'm afraid there is not a logical way to tidy up your informational stuff, so I can't give you that same kind of guidance. You're going to have to decide. Maybe you tidy by team to avoid task switching. Maybe you're tidying a particular independent space. Maybe you're tidying all of the architecture stuff together and then going on to the next thing. It's just going to depend on what you're doing. So that's 5, and she said 6. So what's the 6th one? Aha, yes. Ask yourself if it sparks joy. Now, she's kind of infamous for this because it's very easy to look at it and say, well, that's a bit woo. But what she's talking about is, which is the stuff that you want to own? And that's a really good question for us too. What stuff do we want to keep? What does it look like? How can you tell which stuff it is? You can't look at it and say, does this thing spark joy? Because you don't have that option. You certainly don't have that option for 20,000 pages. But you need some way of figuring out what's the good stuff and what's the bad stuff. Preferably some way that's automated. Now, I ask the question, can you automate finding it? Because the answer is yes. I made a joy detector as part of this process, and I want to talk a little bit about it. So what I do, how to create a joy detector, figure out what pages are good examples of things you want to keep and what pages are good examples of things you'd really like gone. Get some representative examples. Don't go for edge cases. This is never going to be a finely calibrated tool, but it will give you really low resolution results. So get the pages you want to use. Then figure out what metrics you can get from your tool. Now, Confluence has an API which you can call if you have a tool. We have an in-house written tool which calls the Confluence API for all the pages in the space and just gives you the whole thing. And you can export the data around if you need to. Confluence also has an internal reporting page that you can use for the same thing. And it's got information like who made the page and when did they make the page and who updated the page last and when was that and when was the last time anyone looked at the page and how many revisions has it had and how many children does it have and all kinds of stuff like that. Figure out which metrics seem to describe pages well. Do some testing between the two. And then once you think you've got a good joy marker for your organizational situation, test it in a space that you know well. So here's what I did, and you don't have to worry about the specifics of this. This is kind of my training montage screen right here. So I took a bunch of pages that were the sort of things I was looking for, and then I took the 3 metrics that I thought were most interesting. How recently was it looked at? How old is the content? How often do people read it? And then I also asked, okay, should it be in or should it be out? And I looked at where the mapping was, and it was close in some areas, but not super good anywhere. So then I turned it around and I said, okay, right. So if I look at those metrics, what are they leaving in that shouldn't be in, and what are they bringing out that should stay in? And so I looked at the 3 basic ones, and in all cases, there were things that they were leaving out or including that I didn't want. So then I started combining them to see whether I could use them to kind of tune each other. And I tried a bunch of things, and I finally came to one, as you can see at the bottom, that seemed to do reasonably well. And that was this, and I'm calling it weighted view count. And it's average daily views over the number of days since the page was last viewed, plus 1 because dividing by 0 is bad. You'll notice what's interesting about this is that I had looked at content age in my evaluation, but I didn't end up keeping content age in, because it turns out that the people who can tell you what your users want are your users, and their behavior will actually tell you what they want. And we're back to paving desire paths again, aren't we? So I looked at this and it was pretty good. I could get pretty much everything, but it wasn't quite there. There were still some things that weren't quite right. So what I found is that I could improve it by increasing the weight of the view age. So I did that. And then I multiplied the whole shebang by 10,000 because I wanted to give a number that was easy for people to interpret, and it was just way too far down past the decimal point. It didn't seem like a good idea. So this is not actually necessarily completely automating finding joy. This is just one step along the path. Because the next thing you do, if you are, as I am, I confess, an Excel addict, is you load the whole thing into a spreadsheet and start messing around with it. So I created what I've been calling heat maps, but I could call them joy maps. It would be fair. And I start by creating a page tree listing. That's a page you can set up in Confluence and then scrape, which just gives you all of the children of the main page of the space. After I had that, then I created a page with using the information from the API call and calculating the weighted view count for each of them. And then I used the name as a lookup to get the weighted view count onto the page tree listing page. And after that, it was just a case of setting up some conditional formatting using the weighted view count number to identify by the color which pages have a higher weighted view count, which pages have a lower weighted view count. In other words, which pages spark joy and which pages don't. This isn't something that you can do and then plug into some auto archiver though. This is a tool for discussion with the team because they will have their own insights into the pages, and they will also find these pieces of information useful in ways that you won't necessarily anticipate. So you can sit down and say, so it looks like this section here is deadwood, but that section up there should probably come along with you. But there's that line right there, which is really interesting because it stands out from everything else and people are looking at it a lot. But then they'll be able to say, oh yes, that thing there, that should go there. And there's something else here that we could be using to do this bit here. And they have got deep, complicated interactions with their data. And they'll be able to do some really interesting stuff if you give them the pointers. So that's what I've been doing with teams. I set up the structure and then I started talking to the teams one by one, group by group, showing them these heat maps and working with them to migrate the content that they wanted into the new space so they could then archive the old stuff. And then we would have, in the end, a single source of truth. Where are we? Is the next question. Where we are, we started, remember, with 33 spaces. 5 spaces could be deleted straight out. They were either so old or in most cases didn't have anything in them because they were false starts. 13 spaces have had all the good stuff stripped from them and the rest of the pages have been archived, which means you can still find them by going to that space and searching it, but the results no longer come up in all of Confluence. 3 spaces have been reclassified because a group of people left NAV and moved to another organizational unit, and their pages should follow them. It's not history that I know about. There are 11 spaces that need to be assessed still. So I have heat maps for them. I have 2 different periods of heat maps for them, so we can compare and contrast between October, when I did a lot of the preliminary work, and a bunch of stuff that I did just last month, so I can see how things have grown and changed. And then there's 1 space that's only been partly migrated, and that's our big old space. I've got about 1 more team to talk to who still have little bright lines in the heat map where there's still a little bit of content there that needs to move. And of course, I've created 1 new space to be the 1 space to hold them all. And let's talk a little bit about that. This new space is already over 10,000 pages. I'm not genuinely surprised by this. We are an active site, we have a bunch of stuff, and we did also bring some cruft with us. I'm expecting we're probably going to bring in another 500 pages or so, so we're just going to be right at the 11,000 page mark, which is a lot for a Confluence space. I cannot dispute this. But we're doing a lot of stuff. And at least it's all in one place, and it's got a structure which mitigates the weaknesses of a large space because we've got options around search and hopefully a structure that's browsable. The average content age and the average last views are both about half of what they were before. So we've left a lot of cruft behind. The oldest page, I went and looked at it just out of interest, and it's a structural page. It's the page for this section on delivery, so it's always going to be around. So it's okay that it's old. Right, so that's where I've gotten so far. Where do I go from here? Well, obviously I need to process those last spaces, and I've got the heat maps, and it's just a case of finding the gaps in the team's schedules where I can get somebody or a few somebodies to work on the content so that we can migrate it and archive what no longer needs to be there, and their stuff can be more easily found. Also, I need to make sure we don't go back to that circumstance again, which means I really need to create a maintenance checklist and a schedule. And I have a rough version of both of them, and it certainly is going to use the heat map again because that tool turns out to be extremely useful and something I definitely want to keep doing. And I also want to create, and I know this is bad because I'm documenting to work around a functional problem, but I'd like to create a tips and tricks page and popularize it to reduce search frustration, to talk about things like how you should move as far down into the hierarchy as possible to search so that you've got a limited search scope, things like that. That's still a lot to do, even though I feel like I've gotten a lot done. So yeah, wish me luck, will you? Thanks very much.
But yeah, we have so many questions. So selfishly, I'm prioritizing the one that I think I want to know the answer to, which is, have you discovered a way to encourage people to actually update their Confluence pages?
Oh, well,
No, of course not. I can't even use my standard technique of feeding people cookies, which is, like I said, my standard technique. The main thing to do is to get people to care about the Confluence as a whole and then turn it around to them. So they come to you and they say, well, you know, the Confluence is useless, blah, blah, blah. It's like, great, here's a list of pages that you might want to look at. But, you know, more nicely done than that, because if you do it too bluntly, they just like don't. But it is mostly to do with people valuing the content in Confluence enough that you can persuade them to take ownership of keeping track of it. And we do have teams who's, particularly Scrum Masters, who are starting to say, you know what, we do need to have this up to date, so we are going to need to do the work. There's certainly been a lot of support from people who have seen the new site and seen how usable it is and thought, this is great, now we can find stuff. And I think that's part of it, is that a usable site is more likely to be maintained because people don't give up on it. We've had a lot of trouble with people saying, but Confluence is just completely useless because you can never find a damn thing, and so on and so forth and so forth. So I'm hoping that, you know, that it's an upward spiral, that we've got a sort of a, you know, virtuous spiral going on.
I love that. It's a very optimistic way to look at it. And I think that's essential.
I live in hope. I live in hope.
All right. We actually have time for a quick one last question. Do you limit the space and content creation for users and teams?
I don't limit content creation. I limit some of the other administrative things. So that if you want to change templates, if you want to delete pages, you have to go through me, just because I want to make sure I'm aware what's going on. And I will quite often either grant people access if I know that what they're doing is responsible, or else I'll say, here, let me help you with that. And then I can sort of slip a bunch of useful advice in the process. But I'm also planning to show this video at work, because not everybody understands what I was doing when I set this up. And I tried to explain it, but it's hard to get people's attention. But to say, look, I have a conference talk on this, you should totally watch this conference talk, is going to be a way as well to get people to understand what I was doing when I was going to people and saying, you have to reorder your page names. And then, I'm sorry, what?
I think a lot of us are going to be sharing it within our workplaces. So thank you so much, Abi, for this great talk. Sorry that the Q&A was cut a little short, but I really appreciate you taking the time to be here. And
well, I mean, people can track me down, and I can basically answer, you know, either answer privately, or if there's some way people could ask publicly and I could answer publicly. Is there any place where that could happen? Do we have even a space for? There
probably is. Let's coordinate and we will announce it.
Yeah, that would be great. That would be great. Because I probably won't be the only person who's got more questions than there are answers to.
Definitely.
And so if we had like a sort of an answer backlog, sort of green room thing, that would be cool.
Yeah, definitely. We will figure it out. And to all you watching, we will keep you posted on where those are, because clearly these are burning questions for everyone.
Absolutely. And if it doesn't happen by the end of the conference, then at the end of the conference or toward the end of the conference, second half, the last day, you can DM me and I'll answer privately. Actually, Sam is suggesting an unconference, which I could do.
Oh, that is smart.
That would work. I don't think it necessarily solves the structural thing of people having more questions or later questions for speakers. And I'm wondering if you could have some place where that could happen on a more institutional basis.
Yeah, cool. We'll figure it out. But in the meantime, we need to take a short break before the next speaker. And yeah, thank you, Abi, and see the rest of you all soon.
Yeah, take care.